Welcome to the new video of Neurophilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The soul behind depression. In today's world, depression is almost always described in medical terms. We speak of serotonin deficits, hormonal imbalances, and environmental stressors. We link it to trauma, fatigue, and burnout. Science maps every neurotransmitter and prescribes every possible cure. Yet beneath all this clinical precision lies a quieter, deeper truth. A truth that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and pioneer of analytical psychology, dared to explore. He believed that many cases of what we call depression are not simply malfunctions of the brain but messages from the soul. To Jung, depression was often not a disease to be eradicated but a form of communication, a cry from the psyche that something essential in our lives has gone missing. He described this inner breakdown as the neurosis of meaninglessness, a kind of spiritual suffocation that arises not from a damaged mind, but from a life disconnected from its authentic purpose. In Jung's view, when we drift too far from who we truly are, the psyche does not stay silent, it protests, and its language is pain. Modern people live under immense pressure to succeed, to be functional, to perform. From an early age, we are taught to adapt, to pursue achievement, recognition, and stability. We inherit definitions of success that have little to do with our inner reality. We follow career paths chosen for safety, maintain appearances that please society, and conform to roles we never consciously accepted. For years, this adaptation works. The machine of daily life runs smoothly, but eventually, something inside begins to whisper or scream that this is not living. And when that inner voice is ignored long enough, a breakdown follows. Energy evaporates. Enthusiasm fades. The drive that once seemed natural disappears overnight. To the outside world, this looks like failure or illness. To Jung, it was something else entirely. It was refusal. The psyche refuses to continue participating in a lie. It rejects a life lived out of alignment with the individual's personal myth, that unique, invisible story that every human being is born to live. Jung believed that every person carries within them a symbolic narrative, a deep pattern of meaning that shapes who they are meant to become. When someone's external life diverges too far from that pattern, the unconscious revolts. Depression, in this sense, becomes the soul's rebellion against a mechanical existence. It is not a collapse to be cured, but a confrontation to be understood. This perspective is unsettling because it challenges nearly every conventional measure of success. You may have a stable career, a loving family, a well-planned life, and still feel a dull ache inside, an inexplicable void that no accomplishment can fill. Jung would argue that this emptiness is not a defect but grief. The soul mourns the life unlived, the self unexpressed, the dreams abandoned for the sake of survival. Living someone else's myth, even skillfully, is a quiet kind of death. When a person continues to ignore that internal mourning, the body eventually steps in. It slows down. It grows weary. Apathy, exhaustion, and discouragement become the body's language of protest. This is not a malfunction, it is protection. The psyche shuts down the false performance to safeguard the fragile ember of authenticity still burning within. In this way, depression becomes a threshold, a point where the outer narrative collapses so that the inner one can emerge. The tragedy of our time is that we often treat this threshold as an error. We medicate it, silence it, or drown it in distractions. We do everything except listen. Yet for Jung, the way out of despair is not through denial, but through dialogue, with the self, with the silence, with the pain. He once wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Depression, then, is not only a descent into darkness, it is an invitation to honesty. It demands that we stop running and face the question, whose life am I living? In this first stage of the journey, Jung asks us to reimagine depression not as failure, but as initiation. The psyche, tired of compromise, pulls the emergency brake on a life lived in disguise. What seems like destruction is often the soul's attempt to rebuild from truth. Behind the fog of sadness, behind the collapse of willpower, lies an unseen intelligence calling us inward, to realign, to reawaken, and to remember the person we were meant to be before the world told us who to become. That is where Jung's understanding begins, with the possibility that what we call depression is not an ending, but the first whisper of a new beginning. The mask and the void. From the moment we are born, society begins its quiet shaping. We are taught how to behave, what to value, and who to become. Our worth is measured not by inner truth, but by external success, grades, approval, beauty, money, reputation. We learn that to be accepted we must perform, and so, brick by brick, we construct what Carl Jung called the persona, the social mask designed to please the world. There is nothing inherently wrong with this mask. It helps us function, connect, and survive in a collective world. But the danger lies in forgetting that it is a mask. Over time, many people begin to mistake their role for their reality. The businessman becomes his career, the parent becomes their duty, the artist becomes their audience. Slowly, the living soul inside disappears behind the performance. This is the seed of the void that grows silently beneath outward success. Jung observed that when individuals identify too strongly with their persona, the psyche begins to starve. What the world calls achievement, the soul calls imprisonment. And eventually that silent hunger surfaces as depression, not as weakness but as rebellion. We often imagine depression as the absence of feeling, but in Jung's understanding, it is full of meaning. It is the soul's way of declaring, I can no longer breathe inside this mask. The sadness that seeps through even the brightest days, the apathy that makes every task feel heavy, these are not symptoms of laziness or failure. They are signs that the outer life and the inner life have grown too far apart. Consider how many lives look complete from the outside yet feel hollow within. The family portrait, the stable income, the planned vacations, all immaculate yet strangely lifeless. The individual keeps moving, but each step feels rehearsed, drained of vitality. This is what Jung called the psychic split, a fracture between the image we show and the self we hide. And though invisible, it drains the spirit like a slow leak. Over time, this disconnection becomes unbearable. The mind may continue working, but the heart retreats. Joy feels distant. Conversations become mechanical. Days merge into grey sameness. It is as if one is living underwater, moving, breathing, but muffled from the world's vibrancy. To the medical eye, this may appear as depression. To Jung, it is meaninglessness, the soul mourning the distance from its own truth. This crisis often arises not in failure, but in success. It comes when a person reaches the summit they were told would bring happiness and finds only silence. The greatest tragedy, Jung might say, is not to fail, but to succeed at the wrong thing. To climb the ladder of life and realize too late that it was leaning against the wrong wall. Such moments of inner collapse can feel like betrayal. The very structures that promised fulfillment, career, relationships, reputation, begin to feel alien. But in Jungian thought, this collapse is not destruction, it is disclosure. The soul has grown tired of pretending. What seems like loss is the psyche's attempt to restore balance, to dissolve illusions and summon authenticity. The modern mind, however, fears this unraveling. It seeks to silence discomfort with distractions, work, entertainment, self-help platitudes. But Jung warned that avoidance only deepens the split. To heal, one must listen to the void. Depression, he suggested, is not a signal to escape life, but an invitation to enter it more deeply, to confront the forgotten self that waits behind the persona. In that silence where nothing seems to make sense, meaning begins to gestate. The very emptiness that terrifies us holds the key to transformation. Beneath the fatigue, something ancient stirs, the impulse to live one's own story instead of performing another's. It is painful, yes, but profoundly sacred, for the soul cannot remain hidden forever. When it rises to the surface through suffering, it does so not to destroy the person, but but to save them from false roles, from borrowed dreams, from a life that no longer fits. What feels like falling apart is often a form of rearranging, a psychic reordering that prepares the ground for new life. And so, Jung teaches us that the mask must eventually crack for the face beneath to breathe again. Depression then is not the end of vitality, it is the withdrawal of energy from the false self, the quiet dismantling of illusion. Only when the persona breaks can the real story begin to unfold. In the next chapter, we will explore what happens when the unconscious begins to protest more loudly, how the soul communicates through exhaustion, disinterest, and despair. These are not random afflictions, but signals, the protest of the soul against a life unlived. The protest of the soul. Not all pain is noise. Some pains are language. They are not here to torment us, but to tell us something we have refused to hear. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He believed that what we often call depression is sometimes the psyche's attempt to communicate, a rebellion of the unconscious against a life that has strayed too far from its truth. When a person lives for years cut off from their inner calling, the soul begins to resist. But this protest rarely arrives as a clear voice. It speaks in symptoms: apathy, fatigue, restlessness, a hollow indifference that colors everything. What once brought joy now feels lifeless. Even beauty loses its sparkle. And though the world insists on fixing it with quick solutions, Jung warned that such pain is not meant to be silenced. It is meant to be understood. He saw the psyche as an intelligent system, always seeking balance. When one part of us, usually the persona, takes too much control, the other side begins to rebel. That rebellion is not destruction, it is correction. Depression, in Jung's language, is a symbolic refusal of the soul to participate in a lie. The body slows down, the emotions retreat, and life itself seems to stall, forcing us to stop and look inward. In modern culture, this slowing is terrifying. We have been trained to equate movement with worth. Productivity is worshipped, stillness is pathologized. So when depression halts our rhythm, we panic. We call it illness. We rush to suppress the signal rather than listen to its message. But Jung would tell us, the psyche collapses not because it is broken, but because it is trying to heal. Consider the exhaustion that lingers even after rest. It is not the body that is tired. It is the self that is weary of pretending. The mind resists not because it cannot continue, but because it should not. The unconscious, in its mysterious wisdom, begins to pull energy away from activities, relationships, and goals that no longer serve our growth. It is as if the soul whispers, "You are going the wrong way." And yet, the more we ignore that whisper, the louder it becomes. It infiltrates our sleep, our concentration, our health. It manifests as chronic fatigue, insomnia, loss of appetite, creative paralysis. These are not random afflictions, they are symbols. Jung called them the voices of the self, urging us to realign. He believed that energy, when cut off from its natural expression, does not disappear. It turns inward, becoming tension, anxiety, or despair. To Jung, the cure is not in forcing positivity or numbing emotion, but in dialogue, with the unconscious, with the dream world, with the forgotten self. He often reminded his patients that symptoms are not enemies but guides. The pain, he wrote, is the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. And so, the task is not to eliminate pain but to interpret it, to ask what it is trying to reveal. Imagine depression not as darkness but as an eclipse, an obscuring of the light, not its destruction. The sun is still there, it is merely hidden behind something that must pass. The psyche demands that we face our shadow, the rejected parts of ourselves that we have denied to fit in, to succeed, to be loved. These buried fragments begin to rise, seeking integration. They come disguised as sadness, but beneath that sadness lies vitality, waiting to be reclaimed. This process is not gentle. The unconscious does not negotiate. It insists. It dismantles illusions layer by layer until only the truth remains. But within that dismantling lies the beginning of healing. Jung described such crises as liminal thresholds, doorways between who we were and who we are meant to become. Depression, then, is not simply collapse, it is initiation, a call to transformation. The great mistake of modern life is to treat this inner protest as failure. We rush to medicate the silence, to drown the stillness with noise. But the psyche will not be deceived. The more we resist, the deeper it burrows until we finally surrender, not to despair, but to honesty. To listen to the protest of the soul is to acknowledge that something within us seeks birth. It may be a forgotten talent, a suppressed desire, or a calling long denied. The moment we stop fighting and begin to listen, depression shifts its shape. It ceases to be a tomb and becomes a threshold, a passage toward renewal. In the next chapter, we will descend even deeper to the underworld Jung spoke of. There, in the symbolic darkness where all falsehood dissolves, begins the mysterious process of rebirth, where pain is not erased, but transformed into meaning. The descent and the rebirth. Camus, depression was never simply darkness. It was a descent, a journey into the underworld of the soul, where light cannot yet reach. He saw this as an archetypal process, as old as myth itself. The Greeks called it katabasis, the hero's journey into the depths, the necessary confrontation with shadow before renewal can occur. The individual who experiences deep despair, Jung wrote, is unknowingly crossing the threshold into this same sacred terrain. Everything familiar begins to dissolve. The beliefs that once structured life lose their meaning. The roles we've played, dutiful parent, achiever, caretaker, intellectual, begin to feel like masks that no longer fit. It is as though the ground beneath existence has given way, leaving only silence. This silence is terrifying, but it is also fertile. In Jungian thought, it is in this very collapse that the possibility of rebirth begins to germinate. Jung believed that the psyche has its own rhythm of transformation, an internal alchemy that uses suffering as raw material. Depression, then, becomes not a dead end but a crucible. It burns away illusions until only what is essential remains. What dies in this process is not the person, but the persona, the constructed self that once sought approval, safety, and admiration. Its death is painful because we have mistaken it for who we are. But beneath its ashes, something incorruptible waits to rise. This descent often feels like abandonment. The old life no longer fits, and the new one has not yet begun. Jung called this the threshold state, an in-between world where the ego feels lost and powerless. Yet, paradoxically, it is here that transformation takes root. When all outer scaffolding crumbles, the soul begins to rebuild from within. What feels like ruin is, in truth, the clearing of ground for a new foundation. Myth after myth reflects this truth. Inanna descending through the 7 gates, stripped of every symbol of status. Orpheus descending into Hades in search of his beloved. Christ entering the tomb before resurrection. These are not stories of punishment, they are maps of transformation. Jung recognized depression as our personal version of this descent, an archetypal pattern where the old identity dies so the true self can be born. But there is a vital distinction to make. Descent is not surrender to despair, it is surrender to truth. Jung urged that one must walk through the darkness consciously, not numb it. The instinct to escape through distractions, substances, or false positivity halts the alchemy. The psyche needs us to endure the tension between what was and what is becoming. It is in this tension, unbearable though it may seem, that the transcendent function, the psychic mechanism that unites opposites, begins to operate. Jung described the transcendent function as the meeting point between the conscious ego and the unconscious self. When the ego stops resisting and listens, a dialogue begins. Dreams intensify, symbols surface, synchronicities appear, those uncanny coincidences that seem to whisper, "Pay attention." The unconscious starts to collaborate with consciousness, offering images and intuitions that guide the soul toward balance. Out of the dialogue between shadow and light, a third thing emerges, a new attitude, a new way of being. Those who go through this process often describe a subtle shift. The sadness remains, but it gains dignity. Pain is no longer meaningless. It begins to point somewhere. The person still feels sorrow, yet beneath it, there is a quiet sense of direction, as though something is holding them through the storm. This is the first glimmer of rebirth, the slow return of vitality, not as euphoria, but as grounded presence. Rebirth, Jung emphasized, is not about erasing the past. It is about integrating it. The descent transforms suffering into knowledge and weakness into wisdom. Scars become symbols of survival, proof that the soul has walked through fire and emerged tempered, not destroyed. When a person reaches this point, they no longer chase superficial happiness. They seek meaning, coherence, and wholeness. To emerge from depression, in the Jungian sense, is not to get back to normal. It is to awaken into authenticity. It is to rebuild a life that reflects the truth discovered in the depths. The individual rises, not as they once were, but as who they were meant to be all along. The darkness, then, was not punishment, it was passage. Every descent is preparation for ascent. The ego dies, but the self is reborn, wiser, quieter, more whole. And from this new center of being, the individual begins to live with integrity, guided not by fear or imitation, but by purpose. In the next and final chapter, we will explore what it means to live from this reborn place, to walk in the world no longer as a mask, but as a self, to live not perfectly, but authentically, and why, for Jung, this is the truest definition of healing. Living from the self. Reaching the far side of despair is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a new one. To live from the self, as Jung called it, is to step out of the shadow of illusion and into the light of authenticity. It is not a life without pain or uncertainty, but a life with direction. Depression, in this context, was never an enemy, it was a teacher. Through it, the soul forced a confrontation with truth, and now, having faced that truth, the individual must learn to live it. Jung warned that this transformation is not about becoming extraordinary, it is about becoming real. Living from the self means embodying the inner alignment discovered during the descent. The false personas, those old masks built for approval or protection, no longer hold power. One begins to act, speak, and choose in harmony with what feels essential, even if it defies the expectations of others. The self does not seek applause, it seeks coherence. In practical terms, this can look deceptively ordinary. A person might leave a career that once defined them, not to chase fame, but to rediscover meaning. Another may rekindle a forgotten talent, care for a garden, write again, or learn to sit quietly without distraction. What matters is not what they do, but the quality of being behind it, the sense that their actions arise from the center rather than the periphery. To live from the self is to inhabit one's life fully, with both light and shadow intact. Jung emphasized that integration is the true form of healing, not the removal of pain, but the inclusion of it within a larger whole. A person aligned with their self does not deny suffering, they give it a place in their story. They understand that joy and sorrow are not opposites, but partners in the dance of wholeness. Such a life often looks quieter than before, yet infinitely more alive. The constant inner noise, the anxiety to please, the fear of failure, dissolves. Decisions become simpler, guided not by what seems profitable or respectable, but by what feels true. Relationships deepen because authenticity replaces performance. Success is no longer measured by comparison but by connection, with one's work, with others, with the world, and with the deeper rhythm of existence itself. Jung described this state as living one's personal myth. Every individual carries within them a symbolic narrative, a story that only they can live. Depression often arises when this story is ignored or replaced by another's script. But once the individual reclaims their myth, life gains narrative meaning again. Even the smallest gestures, writing a line, cooking a meal, speaking an honest word, become part of a coherent whole. Purpose ceases to be a grand abstraction. It becomes the texture of daily being. Living from the self also demands courage, for authenticity often provokes misunderstanding. The person who begins to follow their inner path may be met with confusion or disapproval from those still bound by convention. Jung acknowledged this solitude as an unavoidable price of individuation. To be faithful to one's soul sometimes means walking away from what once provided safety, but what is gained is infinitely more precious. Integrity, vitality, and an unshakable sense of belonging within one's own existence. This does not mean perfection. The journey toward wholeness is lifelong, full of cycles of forgetting and remembering, falling and rising again. But once a person has glimpsed the self, they can no longer return to the old state of unconscious conformity. Even in struggle, there is awareness. Even in sadness, there is meaning. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." To live from the self is precisely that privilege, the ability to inhabit one's humanity fully, to be at peace within imperfection. In such a state, happiness is no longer the goal, meaning is. Joy becomes quieter, steadier, rooted. Pain too becomes bearable, because it fits into a larger pattern. It is no longer chaos but consequence, part of the unfolding of the myth. Every emotion, every failure, every scar becomes integrated into the mosaic of being. To live from the self, then, is to stand at the intersection of the human and the divine, the conscious and the unconscious, the ordinary and the eternal. It is to realize that fulfillment does not come from escaping life's contradictions, but from embracing them with open eyes. The individual who lives this way no longer asks, "Why must I suffer?" but rather, "What is this suffering asking me to become?" And in that shift, from resistance to reverence, the journey that began in darkness finally finds its purpose. Depression was never the enemy. It was the threshold, the summons, the initiation into a deeper kind of life, a life no longer borrowed but truly one's own.